Hi, everyone, and welcome back. So, my last lecture, I talked about literature and the developmental needs of children ages 5 to 7. Today, we're going to be talking about Junie B. Jones and the needs of younger readers. So, we're going to focus on the cognitive, social, and emotional needs of readers and how those needs are matched by the book and how the characters in the book reflect the developmental changes that kids are going through at that particular time in their lives. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the controversy with this book and some things for you to look for as you're reading. So let's get started. From the New York Times. The publisher of the Junie B. Jones series Random House wrote that books for children don't always have to be educational to be valuable. And I talked last time about how books for this age really should also stress things like play and the imagination. It's important for children to have that during this time in their lives. At any rate, this is part of the article. So Random House said that the books don't always have to be educational to be valuable, and this is what one woman had to say. No wonder we have declining literacy and writing proficiency rates in this country. Not long thereafter, she began to debate the series, the Junie B. Jones series, with other parents online. She found that her distaste for the books was on par with her distaste for the people defending them. People who were taking exception to the people who disliked the series were the ones using words like dumb and stupid, she said. There's this bizarre bullying thing that happened. So essentially, a lot of parents, like this woman, Mrs. Scales, took offense to these books and I think a lot of times we use the word banned. Books are not typically banned in a school or school library. They can be challenged, however. Challenging a book means that a parent typically or a group of parents says, I don't think that children of a certain age should be reading that book. So sometimes a book might just be moved to a different shelf. Sometimes a book might be recommended to not be part of the required curriculum. So that means like a teacher might not have to read a book during class time. Maybe if parents don't care for the book and don't want their kids reading it, they might have to pick something else. But it usually isn't just taken out of school libraries altogether. But basically she's saying that the people who did like the book were calling her stupid and dumb and saying that she was dumb for not liking the book and she was stupid for bringing up challenges. But we're going to talk about why, and it's one of the reasons I chose this series for you guys to read, because I do think that there are some interesting things happening here. But first, let's talk about the book itself. The Junie B. Jones series was published between 1992 and 2013. There are 28 books in the series, and they follow Junie B., a precocious little girl, from kindergarten to first grade. I think that the author had possibly planned on taking her into second grade and maybe eventually third grade, but unfortunately she passed away before she could write any more books in the series. The books, and I think you guys have the box set, they're typically sold in box sets because of their length. So each book is comprised of short chapters. They're chapter books. We talked about what those are, right? I think each one has maybe 8,000 to 10,000 words in them. Very short chapters, and then a plot that spans typically the length of the book. Although we do see each chapter will be a separate short scene. Sorry, too many S's. A separate short scene in the book. So, for example, when we have Junie B in the smelly bus, I think is the first one where she goes to school. She's talking about getting on the bus, maybe in one chapter. The next chapter, she's on the bus. The chapter after that is her meeting her teacher for the first time. The chapter after that is her meeting a girl, that Grace, for the first time, right? So each chapter is like one short scene. You can think almost like watching a TV show where they have commercials very periodically, right, after each scene. So sometimes Chapter books are episodic in nature. That's that word again, meaning that each chapter is a separate episode with a beginning, middle, and end. Other times, as in this case, the chapters are going to be part of a plot that resolves at the end of the book. The first book depicts Junie B's first day in kindergarten. Then we see the birth of her brother, school career day, a misunderstanding with her teacher, those types of plots. So what this would be considered is contemporary realistic fiction, meaning that it is taking place now and it's not fantasy, right? It's fiction, but it's something that is fairly realistic to what little kids go through. So the age range for these books, they're longer than picture books, but shorter than novels. We talked about that before. Chapter books are really meant to help children transition. And I don't think we have many chapter books before the 90s. This is one of the early chapter book series that came out. As I mentioned before, historically, before the 70s, really, everything was sort of lumped together as just children's literature. Then we got things pulled out to be children's and young adult, and then we had children sort of stratified depending on developmental needs. So I think it's a really great development. It's a book series that kids in, kindergarten, first, second grade really respond to. And because they like it, then they want to read, longer books. The protagonist age, the length of the books, the language used, and the pictures. There's pictures on pretty much every page. The illustrated series is intended for younger children. So some kids who are a little bit older think that it's just sort of funny, like reading about a younger kid and remembering what they went through. Some kids who are in the, around 4 or 5, a parent might read this book to them or a teacher might read it to them. Really, 6 and 7-year-olds, really. Just like the age of the protagonist. So, cognitive development. The stories are very straightforward. So again, one plot for the length of I think each book is about 60 pages long, 60, 70 pages maybe with the pictures. The setup, the complication, and then the resolution. Beginning, middle, end. A fairly routine and predictable. So this is Junie B. Jones and a Little Monkey Business. Junie B's grandmother says, "Oh, I saw him. He's such a little monkey." And Junie B then insists to her entire class that her brother is a monkey. Her teacher says for her to stop that, and she refuses to believe otherwise. Cognitively, this is something that I mentioned in the last lecture. Kids who are 4 or 5 or 6 have difficulty seeing things from another person's perspective. They're also learning vocabulary, and they don't understand many times figurative language. So hyperbole, exaggerations, they sometimes will take as real, right? So if they say, "How old are you?" and I'll say, "Oh, I'm like 100 years old," right? Might just because I'm tired that day, but they'll say, "Oh, Miss Hall is 100 years old. She's old," right? They don't understand those kind of figurative things. So Junie B really is only able to see things from her perspective, and that's something that I want you to notice, especially since she is the narrator. In literature, this is called limited narration. Limited first-person narration. We're going to talk about this more in some of our, in some of our middle grade novels. A third-person narrator might be limited or they might be omniscient, meaning that they know everything and can see everything. But Junie B really is a 6-year-old. So she can't understand symbolic language or figurative language. Feelings determine her actions. So again, very typical of children that age. Cognitively, they struggle with logic. So what I'd like you to look for in terms of cognition, where are there places where Junie B can only see things from her perspective and lacks empathy or lacks, especially with adults, understanding what they want her to do or what they're expecting from her. And Places where feelings determine what she does instead of actions. So times where she might be very impulsive and just driven by what she's feeling in that moment. Emotional development. I want you to notice the way that she talks about her feelings and the feelings of others. Again, something that I talked about in my last lecture. Developmentally, feelings come out in physical terms. So that is something to watch for. When she says, my eyes went very big, because she's surprised or maybe scared, right? Or Mrs., that's her teacher. Mrs. had a face that turned red and a mouth that went all frowny. So she's kind of noticing that her teacher is angry, but she can't really put that emotion onto another person, right? So a lot of times they're coming out in those kinds of physical terms, or she was clenching her fists, or my tummy felt swirly, those types of things. I also want you to watch for how Junie B reacts in situations. Again, she's definitely driven by emotion, but I want you to think about whether or not she grows or changes at the end of each story. A static character is one who does not change, meaning that they stay the same from the beginning to the end. A dynamic character changes by the end of the story. And that's something, I spelled this wrong. Put a little N in there. That's something that it's so hard. I'm trying to write with a mouse. So you're just going to have to remember those words, I guess, static and dynamic. A dynamic character changes from the beginning to the end. A static character really doesn't change at all. So I want you to think about whether Junie B learns anything and whether she grows or matures by the end of the story. And possibly, if you have time to read all 4 of them, in the box set, does she change by the end of the box set, by the end of book 4? I'd like you to read at least 2 of them, just to kind of see the pattern. Also, and I'll talk more about this with some of the social stuff, but watch for peer interactions. Understanding parents and teachers is one thing emotionally, but does she understand the emotions or points of view of her friends or classmates? Is she completely self-centered, or can she kind of see what they're thinking or what they're feeling? So those are some of the things to look for emotionally. Socially, that picture kind of came out a little light, but you can hopefully see it still. In the first book, I want you to watch how Junie interacts with others. And again, I'd like you to read the first story and then one of the other 3. As the series progresses, much like children this age, moving from kindergarten into first and then by the end of it, almost into 2nd grade, peer relationships are going to become a little bit more important, and friendships. So the first book, Junie B really, a lot of the time she's alone thinking about her situation, not really interacting too much with peers. They are there. She does meet them, learn their names, but this is a solo adventure. I'll put it that way. Also, the anxieties about starting school, being away from her mom for the first time or her parents, as she experiences these anxieties, how does she fail to properly communicate her feelings? So socially, having problems talking to people, interacting with them, telling them what her needs are. Later, the peer interactions which occur, I think, are still from a self-centered point of view, but that does change as the series goes on a tiny bit. Richie Lucille and that Grace, 2 of the people in the story. So one of the things you can look for is the lack of empathy, the difficulty she has seeing her friend's point of view, and the same thing with them. They really kind of only know what their perspective is, right? So that lack of empathy there. Many of the friendships seem to be a little bit superficial to older readers. So Junie B's best friend is Grace, because that Grace sits next to me on the school bus. We don't have When you're kids, you go up to the sandbox and you say, "Can I play with you?" And the other kid says, "Sure." And you go, "Good, we're best friends now." That's it, right? Older kids develop a little bit more deep relationship with each other. So we'll talk about that next time. That true school age where friendships are based, on things like common interest rather than just proximity. In addition, fights they might have fights and they might have an argument. They're resolved very easily because kids don't remember things, and they'll forget about things by the next chapter. So friendships and arguments or enemies in the same way. It's fairly common with younger children as self-identities are being built. Here, a child's self-identity is built around what they do rather than who they are. So I run fast. I'm a fast runner. That's what I do, right? So therefore, that's who I am. Later, as emotions become more complex and we go through life, our self-identity changes. So look for narration and characterization. I mentioned this before. Junie B is a first-person narrator of the book. So very self-centered. Everything is focused on Junie B and her point of view. Again, not in a mean way, like she's a jerk, although we could debate that, I guess. But just because that's, her age and that's her development. As a result, we don't have really in-depth characterization. We do of Junie B. She's, I think, a round character rather than a flat. But the other people in her life are not fleshed out quite so much. That's Mrs. My Teacher. That's my grandpa, Frank Miller. We have their names. We know a tiny bit about them, but we don't go into too much depth, at least not in the first books of the series. Again, as the series goes on, you get to know characters more. I put this in there. Her parents are almost ancillary figures. What I mean by that is her parents are there and they're important. Her teacher and the principal, they are also there and they're important. But they're not as important as they are in other children's books. So the principal, the grandparents, the janitor, they play kind of small role in the books. They're inscrutable adults. They try to explain things, or they keep her from doing something that she wants to do. But I think that there are other series for kids this age where the parents are really quite a bit more involved and more sources of comfort rather than irritation. And I think that's one of the reasons that some parents don't like these books, because of how adults are kind of to the side. And then we also have this very self-centered point of view. Yeah, even her teacher is referred only to as Mrs. So here is an excerpt. The bus wasn't like my daddy's car at all. It was very big inside and the seats didn't have any cloth on them. The little curly girl was sitting near the front, so I tapped on her. Guess what? I said. Mother said for me to sit here. No, she said. I'm saving this seat for my best friend, Mary Ruth Marble. Then she put her little white purse on the place I was going to sit, so I made a face at her. Hurry up and find a seat, young lady, said Mr. Wu. And so I quick sat down across from the curly mean girl, and Mr. Wu shut the door. It wasn't a regular kind of door, though. It folded in half, and when it closed, it made a whooshy sound. I don't like that kind of a door. If it closes on you on accident, it'll cut you in half, and you'll make a squishy sound. The bus made a big roar. Then a puff of black, smelly smoke came out the back end of it. It's called bus breath, I think. So some of the things you can see here, her describing things from a little kid's point of view, right? Here's the bus. I expected it to look like a car. It didn't. I've only known my daddy's car before, so I just kind of expected that the bus would be just like his car. Then wanting to sit someplace because her mother told her to, having a negative interaction with a peer, the girl saving the seat for somebody else, so she sticks out her tongue possibly or crosses her eyes at the little girl, and keeps calling her the little curly girl rather than giving her a name. And you can also see possibly there are a couple sentence fragments here. Things are we're talking about the girl and using the word mean. And that's part of the controversy with this book. So the first tension and controversy is characterization. I put banned or challenged books, and that's, again, meaning that parents said, hey, I don't want this being read to my kid. We have a person in Junie B's class who she calls Meanie Jim. I think the first reason for some of this controversy is because of Junie B herself, the way that she's characterized. Parents say that she's not a role model. She gets in trouble. There's no consequences. She talks back to parents and teachers. She calls other children names like stupid meanie or big fat Jim, who I hate. The author responded to this and said, some people believe that the value of a children's book can only be measured in terms of the moral lessons it tries to impose or the perfect role models it offers. Personally, I happen to think that a book is of extraordinary value if it gives the reader nothing more than a smile or two. So, I have to say, I feel both ways about this. I can see both perspectives. I think on the one hand, parents and teachers really want books for kids that model good behavior, and they want them to learn how to be a good kid, a good citizen, a good student, a good child at home, right? All of those things. But when you have perfect children in books, they're incredibly boring. So the problem here, I think, is that really, developmentally, Junie B is a 6-year-old and talks like a 6-year-old talks. And so I think that some of the difficulty is that parents don't want their kid seeing things from a self-centered point of view, but developmentally that's appropriate, right? And then we have things like calling somebody a meanie or big fat Jim, who I hate, or a stupid head. Again, parents don't want that for their children. So that part I can kind of understand. I do, though, agree with the author that not every book has to have a perfect little child who's an angel and a saint. And if they are, it's not interesting to read. It's dull and it's boring and kids don't want to read it. And it's not funny either. So a lot of what parents do with this book is that they, in terms of this part, the characterization, a lot of times what I've seen is parents will tell me things like, well, I do read it with my child so that we can say, oh, she said that to her mother. Was that nice? Or what else could she have said to her teacher instead of talking back? So kind of acknowledging that the book is funny, but at the same time mirroring proper behavior with questions and answers as they're reading. The language in the book is sort of controversial as well. The books are written in vernacular. Vernacular means everyday language with dialect, spoken by a region or country, or in this case, spoken by a child. So the I think phrase is something she says a lot. So she'll say something like, no, because I have a bow on my head, I think, and that means that I am pretty today, right? A person might say in slang, I ain't going across the street just to get my darn mail, while another person would say, not in the vernacular, or in a different vernacular, I won't go over a street just to get my stupid mail. Junie B uses the vernacular of a 5 or 6-year-old, so a lot of things are not grammatically correct. And one of the problems here with teachers is that they don't want sentences like, I runned away very quick. That is a sentence from the book. My tummy went swirly and my face felt hot and I runned away very quick. Because children pick up vocabulary and sentence structure at this age from things that they read. So having things written incorrectly is something that a lot of parents sometimes object to, but particularly teachers. So I know first grade teachers who will not keep this book in their classroom. I also know third grade teachers and second grade teachers who do keep the book in their classrooms because by that age, a kid will not say, I runned away, right? They'll know that it should be, I ran away very quickly. Other times there's sentence fragments. So Yeah, so it's kind of a tension within the book, and if you were a parent or a teacher, it'd be something for you to consider. And though that's one of the reasons that I chose this book, I think it's very clear that she's developmentally a 6-year-old, and I think that it's capturing the way that a 5 or 6-year-old talks. But on the same point, it's not grammatically correct. She's not the nicest child in the world either. And she does get into mischief and trouble. So she's using things like funnest and beautifuler. She's saying apology instead of apology. And those are just some more examples. One parent wrote a letter which proclaimed, "I find this the mental equivalent of toxic waste. It's just garbage," is what she's basically saying. So this is something that you'll have to think about, education versus entertainment. Traditionally in children's literature, this is the Children's Book of Virtues from William Bennett. It's actually a nice little book. I have a copy at home, but they are stories that were thought being worthy of being read. So stories that show children being kind, or being gracious, or being generous, or having a problem and going to a mother or father for help, or another parent or guardian or something like that. In the 1900s, very early on, when we started to have the development of children's literature, before the 1900s rather, children's literature was really meant just to teach reading. So you would have primers, alphabet books, and moral instruction. So things that were meant for children to learn how to have good morals. In the early 1900s, we kind of saw a shift in this, and it was called the golden age of children's literature, where it began to focus on imagination and entertainment. So if you think of a book like Tom Sawyer, a little bit before that period, Alice in Wonderland, those types of books, they're supposed to be fun, right? But through the 1950s, we still, for the most part, children's books kind of stressed some sort of lesson to be learned. And we're going to look at that in our next unit as well. But it's not even unusual now for middle grade books or young adult literature to be focused more on entertainment than learning a lesson. However, children's series often still have this focus, and it seems to me that a lot of parents want books for their kids where they're learning a lesson. So they're reading and they're learning. The Berenstain Bear books that I showed you guys in the last lecture, that's a great example. Berenstain Bear's in the trouble with pets. Brother doesn't want to walk his dog and sister keeps forgetting to feed her bird. Berenstain Bear's in the trouble with bullies. Right? There's a bully and we have to fix that problem. Or Berenstain Bears and the kindness cure, where they have to be nice to people and they said something mean to each other. There's another one of too much junk food, right? The list goes on and on. So a lot of books for younger kids are really focused more on education, moral education particularly, and this idea of virtue. And by the time somebody goes into, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, we don't care about that as much. And we really just want kids who are older to like reading and to keep reading and to read for fun. And I think in some ways that's doing a disservice to little kids, because they also need to read for fun. And when they don't, they find the stories boring, as I said before, and they don't like reading. And that's often what happens. So to me, there's a lot of value in a book like Junie B. Jones. This is another excerpt. I'm not going to go into that, but there's a lot of value here. And even though she might not be the perfect child, you can still get something out of it. So just to I guess I'm lying. I'm going to read a little bit. She has to go to the principal's, and she didn't know that she was going to talk to him. So she says, "That's how come I pulled my skirt over my head, or else Mrs., her teacher, would see me there, and she would know that I tattled on her." "Don't do that," said principal. "Yeah, only I'm allowed," I said, from underneath my skirt, because I have on my new red tights and also boxer shorts. So, like, she knows she's not supposed to pull her skirt up, but it's okay because she's wearing boxer shorts underneath, so you can't see anything. After that, principal went out of his office, and I heard my teacher's voice outside the door. Then I quick got down from my big wood chair, and I hid under principal's desk, because I was scared of what was going to happen. That's why. So, again, some of the language, not perfect. I hid under my desk instead of I hid. I quick got down instead of I got down quickly. But it's kind of a funny scene. It's something that kids can relate to, and it really shows their development is really reflected in her quite a bit. So look for ways in which Junie B matches the emotional, cognitive, and social development of a 5 or a 6-year-old closely at how she describes her feelings, her actions, her friendships, and also the adults in her life. So how does she interact with adults? How does she interact with peers? Then look to see whether she's matured either by the end of a book or, again, by the end of the box set. We're going to talk about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle next. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle is all about helping children to learn lessons. And I want to have you look and see whether Junie B ever learns a lesson. Does she face real consequences? Pippi Longstocking we're going to also talk about in our next, not the next lecture, but the lecture after that. I'll talk about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and Pippi Longstocking. It's interesting to me, there doesn't seem to be a controversy about Pippi Longstocking being too boisterous or inappropriate for children. So we're going to talk about why. Junie B gets into trouble just like Pippi does, but the trouble seems to be a tiny bit different. And does this series have value? I think that there is some value here, but I can see people's perspectives who think that it doesn't. So I really want you to think about, if you write about this one for your essay, I want you to consider whether you would assign this to a class or whether you would read it with a kid, and why or why not. And lastly, kind of going along with that, should books for this age be appropriate, or should children be allowed to read about a book with an imperfect or kind of bratty heroine like we're going to see in the Junie B. Jones series? So that is it for this lecture, and I will see you guys next time where we'll talk about development for children ages 8 to 10, and then I'll talk about the books for that age range as well. But I hope you enjoy Junie B, and I hope to see extra comments in the discussion boards. If you have any questions, just email me. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.